Yeah, so under the course information, you have my email address there. Yeah, use it. If you need to clarify things, if you need to let me know about something, email is a great way of doing that. Hopefully I'll see you here every Wednesday. Anyhow, I think being in the class is a really important thing. Yeah, I record lectures. The sound isn't all that great. People plan to watch them and they don't. Some people do. And look, another tip, well, things that other people do, you probably do this already, is that you can watch things at 1.5 speed or 2 speed on YouTube as well. So I put them up on YouTube, and while you're doing the dishes or something, you can have it on 1.5 speed, condense my waffle into a much shorter amount of time. That's a handy thing. But really, the best thing is to come into classes. You get to really engage with everything and get to know people as well. So, yeah, email address there for if you need it. Under that is the unit of competency. So everything that we study, it's predefined by a national body. So there's a national body that write all of the subjects that we teach. We have some discretion over which units we want to pull together into a qualification, but then there's a list, and we have to fit most of those into a qualification. So we get a bit of choice, and we also get a bit of a choice exactly how we treat that unit of competency. Basically it's a shopping list of what you guys have to be able to do by the time you leave. Now, how I get you there, that's my business to an extent, except it is a very comprehensive shopping list. So my job is to look at that, read that unit, and say, this is how we're going to go about this, and this is how I'm going to assess it, and this is how I'm going to record or gather all of that information from all of you. The flow on from that is, with the assessments, I do need you to essentially tick all the boxes, complete everything that the assessments ask for, because I've tried to be as efficient and thorough as I can with my assessments to ensure that I'm only really asking you to display stuff which is actually asked for. So I'm not loading you up with a whole bunch of other things, or I'm not getting you to duplicate things. So I've been as efficient with that as possible. The drawbacks from that are that if you're not completing the assignments or the reports, etc., thoroughly, well then I can't say, yeah, you've met every single requirement. So it is about taking a very thorough approach to the assessments. We'll discuss those a little bit later on, and how I've put that together. But just letting you know, you have to be fairly thorough. Look, if you want to send yourself off to sleep fairly quickly, you can read the unit of competency, get an idea of what we're studying if you make it to the first page. But apart from that, it's basically my job to ensure that we cover all of that. There's a bit of information under there about referencing. So that information talks about how to go about referencing. We are, as you would have noticed in the title, it's a research subject. So this is about research. This is not about reinventing the wheel, so to speak. You can use other people's quotes when you're going through finding information. By all means, quote things that other people have said. You'll definitely have sources of information. Just make those sources of information clear. What I don't want to see is people going onto the internet, grabbing stuff, just dropping it in to reports, and then I'll have to go, oh yeah, where have they covered this? Where have they covered that? And is this their own writing? Because really simply, what I'll do is look, I've read thousands of these things. I'll go, oh yeah, I know that. But if I don't know where it's from, copy, paste in Google. Oh, that's where it's from. Right. So reference whenever you're paraphrasing people. Reference it. Now, I'm not a real stickler for Harvard referencing. I don't need italics and commas and things like that. But I do need to know whether it's your work or someone else's work. That's the crux of it. But also with the research reports that you've got to put together, I've provided you with a skeleton and a whole list of headings, etc., and sections, and you just have to fill out the docs basically. So really, the easiest way of going about it is doing your research, understanding the stuff, and writing small amounts of commentary in there yourself. It's really the simplest way and the best way to go about it as well. Because if you do that, then you'll remember it. If you Google search, cut and paste, chances are you won't remember it. You'll be almost dead set certain you won't remember it. Yeah.
With referencing, do you personally prefer at the end of every paragraph or at the end?
I prefer the end of a paragraph actually, because that identifies it straight away. Yeah. And you can do it in do it in a different colour or something like that to mix that up. What? Yeah. So under the referencing there is the semester outline. I try to stick to the semester outline as much as possible. We'll deviate from that from time to time because sometimes I'll be able to get guest speakers in, etc. Hopefully, we've got a decent sized day class that gives a bit of pull factor for various different consultants or reps from companies. So I might be able to get some speakers in for various different industries. We might also go take a wander around either the TAFE here or near some construction sites nearby as well to see some things firsthand. So there are various different reasons why we might deviate away from the semester outline. But as a general guide, it's up there for you to get an idea of what will we be doing this semester. So download that. Maybe print it off if you want to have a copy there to understand each week by week what you're doing. But basically what I've done in here, I've got sections showing this is what we're covering, this is how we're covering it, and these are the details, and this is when stuff is due. I don't put dates in there because if I put dates in there, I have to keep updating it all the time. But we've got session 1, this session 2, then session 3. We've got filing task due. Yeah, a little bit rude to start talking about assessments bang off the bat. We'll actually sort of get into the meat of that either later today or next week. It's actually a really simple thing. You'll probably get this done if you're reasonably computer savvy. You'll get it done in 15-20 minutes. Doesn't take long. It's about you setting up a filing system. I just want to see, okay, yeah, you've got that filing system set up, and it's about setting up a OneNote. Has anybody in this room used OneNote before? 1? Yeah. 2? Cool. Do you mind me asking what you use OneNote for?
I just use it for another backup, really, for my files.
Yep.
Just in case anything goes wrong, I know it's still there.
Yeah, as a form of backup.
I used it for school.
Use it for school. Oh yeah, for classes and combining. Yeah, that's kind of what we'll be using it for here as well. It's not that I advocate one thing over another, but I've chosen to get you guys to be using OneNote throughout your research because you can share it with me really easily. So you can do your research, pile this stuff in here, create some pages, and put stuff there, and then share it with me, and then I'll be able to look at that at any point in time. Say, oh yeah, you're doing research, you're gathering stuff, you're getting images, information, etc. So that's what you've got to do. It takes hardly any time to set up OneNote, does it? Yeah. So although yes, it's a task, the reason I've made it as a task is because I've got to get you to actually do it. That's it. But it's 15 minutes out of your life. So that's our semester outline. I won't go through that thoroughly. We'll go through it step by step, week by week, but have a read of that in your own time if you wish. You'll see on the Learn pages I'm going through. There's some things here like YouTube videos and then not published to students. That's because my Learn page is always sort of expressing itself in the editing mode, and so I've just got stuff chucked, well, sort of hidden there in the background for pulling out when I need to. But we do have another repository for recordings. So that's down here. So once we've finished this class, if this recording software has worked its magic, I'll be able to put that up onto YouTube later on today, and it'll be there for you to revise if you wish, or for the external students to have a look at. So under recordings, there we go, semester 1 2020 recordings. So I've got that link in there already for you, so that'll go to a YouTube playlist. But also, I've got the semester 2 2019 recordings up there as well. So there's that link to last semester's recordings. Some things change. New technologies come through, etc. There are different requirements every now and again. But a lot of what we're dealing with here is not new. So the building industry is actually there's a lot of change going on at the moment, which is fantastic. But traditionally, it's been a fairly sort of conservative industry without a whole heap of technologies flowing through. So we'll be learning about some stuff which has been around before my parents were born, through to some emerging technologies as well. I'll try to keep a decent mix of that. But basically, the short of that is last semester's recordings are still fairly relevant, basically. So if you want to jump ahead and get a bit of an idea about some things, if you're getting your teeth into the research reports and we haven't covered something yet, by all means, have a look at what's in there as well. That's available for you. So we'll get started on it. So it was mentioned that some people want to get a bit more of an idea about things such as the National Construction Code and Australian standards. Certainly by the end of these 16 weeks, I don't expect you to understand Australian standards or the National Construction Code thoroughly, but the more you can understand about it, the better. How do I say it? Spend a bit of time with it. Definitely volume 2. So we've got 3 volumes of the National Construction Code. We've got volume 1 for commercial buildings. We've got volume 2 for residential and associated residential buildings, and then we've got volume 3 for services like plumbing and electrical. Volume 3 you won't have much engagement with. There are some things that you need to know as drafters or designers in regards to plumbing and electrical, i.e. how close you can put a power point to a sink, for example. What size pipes are typically going to be used, what sort of fall you're going to have on those pipes. That can impact on your planning both within a building and externally. So there's some things you need to know in regards to plumbing and electrical, but predominantly those things are covered within the Australian standards that cover plumbing and electrical. So you'll be looking at volume 1 and volume 2 of the National Construction Code. You'll also be studying a subject called compliance within your course. That specifically covers Australian standards and National Construction Code, and then various other things such as minister specifications. So all the legal constraints to building in Australia. So you'll get a far better understanding of that National Construction Code. But some really simple things about that National Construction Code are, well, first up, people might call it the BCA. Does anybody remember the BCA? So we used to have a book. Well, no, we used to have 2 books about this fat. They were called that was the Building Code of Australia. We had the Building Code of Australia, and then we had things such as the South Australian Housing Code. So we were doing things our own way in South Australia, and then there was the Building Code of Australia as well. It's not all that long ago, 10 years ago or so, that a lot of builders didn't actually have copies of the BCA, and people weren't really referring to it all that much, and they were doing things through their sort of state-based codes, such as the South Australian Housing Code. But then the states got together and produced the National Construction Code. There are some, within the National Construction Code, there are some little things that the states couldn't get together on. So you have a National Construction Code, and then you have some sections there at the end of each section, some bits in pink that are state and territory variations. So, for example, in South Australia, a kitchen is a wet area. Everywhere else in the country, a kitchen is not a wet area. In South Australia, we have to tile to 150 millimetres above laundry taps. In every other state in Australia, we don't have to tile to 150 above laundry taps. I know basically about the stuff we have to do in South Australia. I don't know the quirks of other states. I've only done a little bit of work in New South Wales, that's about it. But be aware that there are some things that were held on to from the South Australian Housing Code that other states said, yeah, no, we don't want to include that. So that didn't get included in the main section of the NCC, but has been included in the state and territory variations. A little bit of a confusing thing about the NCC is those state and territory variations are in each section. So you read through like a section on energy efficiency, we've got a section there. And there will be some state and territory variations at the end of that section. But there's also an appendix right at the back of the NCC that covers state and territory variations, and there's some extra bits in there. You'll go through all the nitty-gritty about that sort of stuff in compliance, but there are some quirks to it. Another simple thing about the NCC is with our residential National Construction Code, our Volume 2 that covers residential, that's very prescriptive in terms of if we're going to be laying bricks, it tells us fairly well how to go laying bricks. Now, you shouldn't just read the NCC and go out and be a bricklayer. There's a whole lot of experience and technique, etc., that goes into all of these things. But the code is actually quite prescriptive. It tells you that you need 10 millimetres mortar gap, that you use an M4 mortar mix within 100 metres of breaking surface, all these sorts of things. It tells you in great detail all of that. Our Volume 1 National Construction Code for commercial buildings doesn't. It's not very prescriptive. It says, masonry has to comply with, AS 3600. What is it? 3700. Anyhow, it says masonry must comply with this particular Australian standard, and that's kind of it. Right, so we've got those two volumes. Your Volume 2 covering housing, very prescriptive. Commercial, not so prescriptive. I think the reason for that is that you have builders who will be reading the NCC. For those working in the residential sector, are taking on smaller projects and not quite as well versed with all of the Australian standards as major construction companies that have the engineers and so on staff. If we say this is how it can be done. So you've got those two different codes, but both of the volumes reference Australian standards. So if you print out the NCC, it's about this thick. They're fairly large documents, but the bulk of the information is actually covered in the Australian standards. So yeah, so for that masonry, for concrete, for example, for concrete, you'll say concrete has to comply with AS 3600, and for residential slabs, AS 2870. So Australian standard 2870 for residential slabs, 3600 for concrete work in general. So if you're doing a bridge, there's no 2870 involved, just AS 3600. AS 3600 will tell you that you need to have your steel a certain distance away from the edge of the formwork, all these sorts of things. So there's a great deal of information in those actual Australian standards. And the way that the NCC is laid out, it says that it says that an approach to building has to do this. So concrete has to survive, basically, and it can't promote rust within the reinforcing steel. So there will be a description of what it has to do, and then an engineer can go, all right, well, I can engineer concrete that will do that, even if it doesn't meet so much the Australian standard. You can have an expert or an engineer say, yes, well, we can meet that. I'll sign off on that. I'm an expert on that. My insurance will cover me if that doesn't work. So that's one approach under the NCC. Or there's another bit in those sections that says if you don't have an engineered solution, then you can comply by complying with the Australian standard. So do it to the Australian standard, and it complies. That's predominantly what we teach here in the TAFE, is what's called deemed to satisfy. So if you meet all of the constraints within the Australian standards that are referenced within the NCC, well, then it complies. And that's predominantly what we teach here. But as drafters and designers, you'll be using engineers and experts in building, all the time for all sorts of things, because there's a whole host of things that aren't covered by Australian standards. And there are emerging technologies which are fantastic and you want to use them. But they'll have to have that engineering certification. Some of you may end up working for engineers as well. So I mentioned we've got these two volumes of the NCC, Volume 1 and Volume 2, that you'll be referring to. The way that they're broken up, so we've got commercial and residential, they're broken up by having different classifications for buildings. So our standard residential is Class 1, and then our multi-residential is Class 2. So all of a sudden, Class 2 goes into our Volume 1 NCC. It's considered to be a commercial building as opposed to just a standard residential building. It's because with your standard house, the people living in that house, they know the house. And you don't have to have specific fire systems and evacuation systems, things like that. Whereas when you start dealing with multi-residential, you do. If there's a fire in one apartment, everybody else in that building needs to know about it. And everybody else in that building has to get out safely. We treat different classes of buildings differently. And that's why the National Construction Code has classifications for buildings, and it's why it gets split into two volumes. This building that we're in here today used to be the Mitsubishi factory. Does anybody remember it when it was the Mitsubishi factory? Or go past? Anybody been down this way? So this used to be, what is it? It would have been a Class 7 building possibly. And now it's a Class 9. Because now it's an education, or it's an institutional building, so it's an educational facility. There are different things you need to have in this building now that it's an educational facility than you had to have in this building when it was manufacturing cars. So we need to have enough toilets. We need to have heating and cooling. We have to have light and ventilation. We need to have warning systems and evacuation systems. Yes, you need to have some of those things for a commercial building as well, for a manufacturing facility. But they differ in scope and scale. So that's why we have different classifications, is because things have to differ. Now, if I go out and buy an old Mitsubishi factory to turn into an educational institution, I can't just go do that without talking to anybody. I'll need to apply with council to do that. So any change in land use has to go through council, and it has to go through certification. Currently in South Australia, we're undergoing massive changes, or massive planning reforms, to our planning system. It's still all up in the air, but the next 6 months is going to be, well, next year I'd say it's going to be very interesting in that space. So things to deal with in terms of dealing with how council do planning and conduct planning and how we engage with council is going to change significantly. It's heading more towards a model of having consultants that do the work for council, so to speak. So private planners, etc. For a long time already, we've already had the ability to have private certifiers. We could have dealt, you know, when we're getting the change of land use for this building, say it has to be changed, has to have these air conditioning systems and warning systems, etc. in there. Previously, we could have just dealt with council and gone to council and say, this is what we've done, supplied them with all the working drawings, and they say, yes, that meets code. That meets the National Construction Code and Australian standards and minister specifications, all good, you can go ahead and do it. That's a very time-consuming, lengthy process. Predominantly what people do now is go through a private certifier. You take all your stuff to the private certifier does exactly the same thing, except they're working for you. So they do it quicker, and if there's a problem, they'll get back to you, or they'll even make changes themselves. And they'll, you know, typically they'll phone you up and say, yeah, Mike, I'm adding this to your drawings, is that fine? I go, yes. And then they send me an email saying, hey Mike, I'm adding this to your drawings, is that fine? Yes. You know, they need to have things right. Yes, Jack?
Would you use that for residential?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As well as commercial?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, the times when you won't use private certifier are pretty rare now. But if you're adding on a carport or something like that, councils charge a rate per square metre. If you're adding 18 square metres, for your building rules consent, it's probably going to cost you around 120 bucks or something to go through council. Private certifiers have their minimum fees at 500 bucks. So you might go, okay, for that, I'll just lob it in with council. I can wait 6 weeks. Doesn't matter. But if you want stuff turned around quickly, or if it's a house, once you start dealing, 80 square metres and up, there's the financial case for going through a private certifier as well, anyhow. So the bulk of everything goes through private certifiers. In fact, so dealing with Yankalilla Council recently, they don't have certification staff on staff anymore. Because, yeah, small council, they don't, people aren't really sending certification stuff to the council anymore. And so you've got to go through a private certifier with some of these small councils. Large councils like mmw1s120, yeah, they still have staff on. But, yeah, there's becoming less and less a case for actually going through council these days. And under the planning changes, there's now also, or there will be, the ability for consultants to work as private planners. So you can send your stuff to a private planner and get that passed. So you can go private planner, private certifier, council doesn't even see it really. Council just get told, yes, this has been built. For some things, right? And we'll see how that all plays out over the next 6 months to a year. Things are meant to be implemented within the outer metropolitan councils in 6 months' time, but I imagine there's going to be a bit of a sort of a teething process for that. Anyhow, we'll cover all that, in more depth in planning and building approval. So, thinking why do I really need to study materials and methods? Well, look, if you want to be successful in the industry, basically, yeah, you've got to know how things are built. Super important to know how things are built, and yeah, and I am a big advocate for getting on sites as much as possible. I've split my professional time between being on sites and being on the tools as well, but in the drafting office, working for a structural engineer, covering lots of odd things. But it wasn't until we started building a house just recently that I, getting more into things that I understand, okay, there's some other things that I don't actually know, that I haven't actually engaged with before, because I haven't been engaged in all of those tasks. So one of them is steel fixing, and actually, yeah, understanding some of the realities around that, and yeah, and trenches and formwork. But beyond that, there's also, say that the health and safety implications of understanding materials and methods as well. So one thing, it's sort of dropped off the radar a little bit. It's not so topical now. It was topical a couple of years ago. So when was that? So 2017. So the Grenfell Tower disaster. Does anybody remember that from in London? Right. Yeah. Well, so for us in the industry, that was a big thing because it was really a lightning rod for or catalyst.
Sorry.
Yeah. You remember it?
It's the residential one, wasn't it?
It was a residential one, yeah. It's not an isolated event. Basically, what happened? So there's an old residential tower block that got upgraded, and aluminium sandwich panel cladding was used on the outside of that. This aluminium sandwich panel is 2 layers of aluminium sheeting with polyethylene, about 3 to 5 millimetres of polyethylene as a core. That makes it, it's a lovely rigid material that stays quite rigid and and you can apply really nice finishes to it and bend it into shapes and things like that. And it's really quick and easy to install. Problem with it is polyethylene is really flammable. If you get a bit of this aluminium sheeting, cigarette lighter underneath it, you get it going and it starts splitting apart and burning and then dropping stuff to set stuff alight down underneath it and setting alight to panels up above it. And that's how we end up with a scenario like that where a fire just went through the building really quickly, igniting it from the outside. Also, the aluminium sandwich panel, the way it's put on there is you typically have something like about a 50 millimetre gap behind it. So once you start getting a fire happening, heats up air, air goes in those gaps, works like a chimney, sucks its way up really quickly, and ignites things above it really quickly. So we've actually had a lot of aluminium sandwich panel used. You don't see it so much on this building, but if you take a wander through under the undercover areas toward the Flinders University section there. So Funk Cafe is one of the places. There's a bunch of places throughout there that actually use aluminium sandwich panel cladding on the buildings. Now it's not all bad. Some are less combustible than others. Some have minimal fibre within those sandwich panels, etc. Other things to help stop it burning. Or there are even new products since this event that are completely non-combustible. But the Grenfell Tower event was a lightning rod for a catalyst for change. But there have been other buildings, like one of the buildings is called the Torch Tower in Dubai, very unfortunately named, did the same sort of thing. There's been Lacrosse in Melbourne. The Lacrosse building's caught fire twice now, I think. And yeah, and that's a particularly good case in point for why I study materials and methods, is because when the Lacrosse building burnt for the second time, which was actually a much larger fire, the rectification work for that was massive, and the liability to cover that rectification work was split between the builder, the architect, and the supplier for the material. So that architect, they had somebody on their staff, you know, somebody within the architectural firm wrote this particular material or similar. That enabled the builder to go, that or similar. I can get this product from China really cheap. I can save about $20,000 on my build by getting this thing because it's similar, like it looks exactly the same, more combustible, etc. Or possibly, look, I won't, yeah, look, I don't know enough to say whether it's more combustible or not, but anyhow, the architect was found about 30% liable. Now, if that's a $10 million rectification work, that's a big insurance, or yes, hopefully you've got to be insured. That's another thing, right? You want to be insured. If you're not insured, well then, trying to find $3 million plus is going to be a difficult thing. But even, even if you are insured, your insurance premium is going to go up. From there, you're going to, it's going to make things very difficult for you. Plus, you're putting people's lives at risk. If none of that matters, at the end of the day, inappropriate use of materials can put people's lives at risk. And it's not just building occupants that you put at risk, but it's people who are doing the work, initial work, who you're putting at risk at times as well. So there are actual frameworks. So we've got Safe Work SA. Safe Work SA are basically the police about how you work safely within any industry in South Australia. Construction industry is a massive thing for them because there are a lot of injuries that happen in construction because it is a dangerous occupation. But one of your obligations identified by Safe Work SA is that you have to design in a manner that won't endanger the people who are carrying out the construction as you've designed it. So you've got to think about the process a little bit, or about the materials, and say yes, we're going to use that. Yes, we're not going to use that. So another case in point is things like Caesar stone. People using Caesar stone, getting silicosis. Anybody heard of that?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Stone cutting and stuff.
for stone cutting, yeah. And so
Kitchen benches and stuff.
kitchen benches, yeah. So and there's also MDF as well. So for cabinet makers, they've got Caesar stone and MDF.
That's still legal.
Well, it's still legal. Both of them are still legal. But whether they're good to be specifying or to be modifying on site is another thing. Like within manufacturing facilities, yes, you have good dust extraction and you have oversight, etc., ways for things to be happening. But if you're specifying certain things to be modified on site, like MDF and Caesar stone, probably not a good idea.
This morning I saw something like that on the way to here. It was the dust was going everywhere. They were cutting stones. It was a residential area. There was a school nearby also.
And so we have various different. We've got bodies like the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Authority. If you do see things like that which are particularly detrimental, stuff, soil washing into drains, etc., from poorly maintained construction sites, or dust generating activities, close to schools, and dust generating activities with no mitigation. Anyhow, you can report those things to Environmental Protection Authority. But there's we've got a responsibility as drafters and designers. Yes, it's a little bit more limited. The responsibility typically lies more on the people, on the tools carrying out the practice, but we have to understand that to an extent to ensure that we're not endangering people. So that's another good reason to study these things, because you don't want to be contacting your insurance to get them to cover you for a mistake that you've made, but even more importantly, you don't want to go putting people's health and lives at risk through a decision that you made about how something should be done. So, how are we doing for time? 10:15. Look, I'll skip OneNote for now, so I might get to that right at the end. But there's a little bit of information here about OneNote introduction and OneNote video. Some things on research and study skills. Go a little bit more. So we're going to cover consultants and authorities. Today, I've mentioned Australian standards. Is there any? Oh, and this is a fantastic thing about the study at TAFE, is that you've got access to Australian standards, right? Now there are moves afoot to give everybody free and unfettered access to Australian standards. I can't wait for that day. That's going to be fantastic. But currently, as it stands, if you go out to if you want a copy of an Australian standard, it's probably going to set you back between $150 and $200 per standard. In the engineering office where I worked, we had a bookshelf of Australian standards, because particularly for that sort of work you're referring, there's hundreds of them, and you're doing all sorts of different bits and pieces. But as drafters, look, I don't know how large the list is, but there'll probably be about 30 to 40 which you'll refer to on a relatively regular basis. They're ones you're going to want to have access to. Now, while you're studying here at TAFE, you've got access to them, which is great. The way you go accessing them is via the library. Has anybody in here been onto the library yet? No? Righty, let's do it. So, if I go back to the portal here, we've got a button there called Library. So now this is all changing. I'm going to see if I can go straight to databases without logging in. Let's give it a shot. No, got to log in. What is my login? Gee, it's been a long summer. Then it works, great. So you'll log in as students. From memory, off the top of my head, is your student ID, and then your birthday, which is day, month. From memory, but I think it's also explained on the library page there as well. So the first time you open it up, it says it there for you. Yep. So that's exactly what you did. You type in your student number. Yep. And so student number and then birthday, which is day, year.
Month.
Oh, day, month. Sorry, day, month. So once you've logged in there, you want to click on databases, and I see that some of you already clicked on databases there already.
Pins changed.
What's that? Oh, your pins changed? Yeah, look, don't need to do it for this class, but definitely sort it out.
Yeah.
And definitely get into the Australian standards. I can't advocate enough for that, because once you no longer have access to the Australian standards, it's very expensive. So to get access to those Australian standards, so we're in databases, online databases, and then you'll go to Australian Standards SAI Global. So click on that, and it'll open up. So we've got a few. Yeah, actually, this is a decent experiment. I want to see whether I can get more than 3 people on it at one time. So 1, 2. Yeah, okay, we've got more than 3. That's great. The reason I mention that is because being such an expensive thing, TAFE SA only has 3 separate licenses for it. So you can only have, this is what I've been told, is that you can only have 3 people searching an Australian standard concurrently. We've got 4, or possibly more. But basically, what that means is this is particularly slow or cumbersome right at the end of semester. Because strangely enough, you get students who go all the way through not accessing Australian standards and have to submit some assignments, and they have to look at some Australian standards. Look, I encourage you to get onto this early, use it as much as you can. Definitely use that resource in the word go. But we've got to this point here, and so we'll type in, let's say, 2870. And that brings up an Australian standard AS 2870 residential slabs and footings. one thing to be aware of when you're searching Australian standards, and look, you don't need to. For those of you mucking around with this right now, you don't have to search for residential slabs and footings. You can search for pliable building membranes or any, just search anything you wish to search for. Explore it a little bit. But you'll notice that there are two things that have come up here under my search results. One of them has available superseded. So all of your old Australian standards are there. So Australian standards get updated, like everything. We want to be referring to the most, or the current Australian standard. So we don't want to be reading the one from 1996, we want to be reading the one from 2011. In 2018, 2019, there's actually quite a few Australian standards that got updated. So, so that's, yeah, so a lot of little bits and pieces changed in the last 2 years. But always refer to the current one. Obviously, if you refer to the old one and there's an updated way of doing something at some given point in time, and then as a result something goes wrong in the future and you get sued, well, essentially you can't hide behind that. You can't say, well, I referred to the Australian standard, because if you refer to the one that's actually superseded at that time, and it relates to what you've done, I wouldn't want to be the person, in that courtroom when that happens. Not that these things happen all too often, but they do happen every now and again. So there are determinations about. I was involved in a determination about too many stairs in a run of stairs. So not that I had anything to do with the construction at all, but it came into our office for us to give an expert opinion on, is this correct, is this not correct? Because this is going to be reviewed. So these things do happen. Best case scenario is you get to know the Australian standards quite well and the NCC quite well, and you're keeping current, and you're all covered. That's the best case scenario. So click on here, view document. That's taken a little while.
Yeah, I had to click it for a while and then wait.
Yeah.
It just loaded now.
Yeah, rightio. Yeah. Now, when we're not covering residential slabs and footings, that's in a couple of weeks' time. But this is the Australian standard for it. This is basically how they're set out. So you've got your contents. So starts off with scope, application performance, etc. What's going to be interesting? So we've got stiffened raft slab, waffle rafts, etc. So it's all broken into sections on how you approach various different bits and pieces. But also an important bit is the scope, saying what this Australian standard actually covers, and it refers to some other Australian standards as well. So one Australian standard you'll see referenced a lot is Australian Standard 1170, so which is relating to structural approaches within construction. So that's the way that the Australian standards are set out. So typically you'll have it broken into sections, and you can go through and find the section you require specifically, but also typically toward the end you also have appendices with drawings showing how things should be done as well. So diagrammatic representation of various different aspects. Not finding a very good example. Oh, here we are. So in terms of slope relationships of excavation, adjacent footings, etc. So that's your Australian standards. Now, as I mentioned before, there's probably going to be about 30 or so Australian standards which you refer to fairly often. One way of knowing which Australian standards you're going to be referring to fairly often is actually having a look at the National Construction Code. Two ways you can go about it. In fact, well, let's do that. Let's do that as our next thing. So we've seen now how we can access those Australian standards. For National Construction Code, is there anybody in here who's accessed the National Construction Code yet? Yeah.
Just go to the website and make an account.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah, I did that.
yeah, you did that. Yeah, great. Yeah. So that's all free. It used to cost about $500, and $500 every 2 years. You'd have to, you know, keep buying the new BCA or the new NCC. Now it's free for everyone to use. To do that, we go onto the Australian Building Codes Board website. Now there was a link from here, so Australian Building Codes Board, but you can also just access it from anywhere, so A, B, C, B. Australian Building Codes Board, and click on that. Yeah, give it a shot, everybody. Get onto the Australian Building Codes Board, and then you either log in or register. So a couple of you will be able to log in. The rest of you have to register.
I just realised I think only three people can get into the actual standard.
Stand at one point in time. Yeah.
Yeah, license only 3 available, 0 available.
All right. Yeah. Where did you find that?
I tried to get in.
Yeah. Right. Oh, and it came up with that. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's not available.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll close. Yeah. So I'll close mine down to let people, let a couple other people have a bit of a surf around in there. So close that. Close that. So with our ABCB site, so the majority of you will have to register. Do that in class now if you wish. That's fine if it doesn't distract too much from what's going on. I'll just see if my desktop isn't showing on here, so I'll have to bring up. I'll have to log in and bring up a copy. So go. Just bear with me for a minute. Just muck around with doing your own logins there, and I'll bring up a copy of the NCC. Okay, so once you've gained access, so you've either created a login or you've logged in again, you go right to the left-hand side and you go and do the NCC suite. Now, what I've typically done is I just download the complete series, and I download the complete series, and I've got that on my computer back in my desk. I've got it on my portable hard drive. I've got it on my laptop at home. It's a handy thing to have access to. Well, you'll end up wanting to have access to it fairly often. So yeah, download the whole thing. And I find it easier to navigate from the downloaded version than viewing it online. But you also have that option of viewing these online. Just remember that when you view it online, as opposed to having downloaded it as a PDF, you navigate it slightly differently. So here we can see, so that's the complete series, but we've got Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. So Volume 3 for services, as I mentioned before, you're not going to be referring to them all that often. Primarily, what you'll be referring to at the start of this subject is Volume 2, because that covers residential. Well, what it does, it covers Class 1 and Class 10 buildings. Class 1 is your standard residential. Class 10 are associated structures, such as garages, swimming pools, fences, antennas, all that sort of thing. So Volume 2 covers both of those classes, 1 and 10. So that's what you'll be referring to at the start. Then as we start moving into multi-residential and commercial buildings, you'll be referring more to Volume 1. So we'll have a look at Volume 2 to begin with. And I'm just going to go on the view as opposed to the PDF, because we're not going to be spending too much time with the actual NCC today. I was just going to give you just a quick rundown. One thing, I haven't done it in quite a while. The reason I haven't done it in quite a while is because I actually printed it off. But within the NCC, there's also a list here, and unfortunately I wasn't prepared for it. I can't remember exactly where it is. A little bit hard to find, but there's a list of referenced Australian standards. So it actually says the NCC refers to these particular Australian standards. What I did when I was studying for my builder's license was I went on there, got the list of Australian standards, printed it off in hard copy, chopped it all up into pieces, so I had the numbers and the names of what that Australian standard is, and then jumbled them all up and started putting them all back together again to remember this is what Australian standard relates to which. It's actually, I think it's actually a fairly good exercise in doing that to know, okay, this is the Australian standard for this. Helps you consolidate that. That was quite a while ago. I can't remember exactly where I got, but that list exists within the NCC, and you can go and see all of the referenced Australian standards. So if you want to get nerdy with it to consolidate that information, I'd suggest that's a good idea. But if you weren't going to go through that process of learning it all off the top of your head, you've got too many other things to do, such as assignments and following lectures within a semester, you'll notice that Volume 2, NCC, is broken up into various different sections. So a building project broken up into various different sections. And it's kind of in order of what we would normally do on a building site. So first one is site preparation. Next is footings and slabs, because we can't go doing our footings without doing some site preparation. And then we've got masonry and framing and roof and wall cladding. We're not going to put a roof onto something until we've got framing to do that. And we're not going to do framing until we've got our footings in place. Now masonry, that can happen after, typically does happen after our framing. All depends what style of building we're doing. But then we've got glazing, etc. So that's sort of set out in that process of how we would actually go about building a building. But then after that, we've got things like fire safety, health and amenities, safe movement and access, ancillary provision and additional construction requirements. Energy, here we go, energy efficiency, and then Schedule 1 state and territory appendices. Now I mentioned there are state and territory variations embedded within the general text, but then also at the end of our NCC. So I'm going to go. Well, so we're looking at footings and slabs. Now I'm going to click on that, and it will take me. Bear with me. I don't normally use the viewer mode. I always use it as PDF. Appropriate performance requirements. So I mentioned earlier that there are two approaches to anything under the NCC. One of them is a performance solution, and another one is a deemed to satisfy. So this performance solution is that where an alternative footing system is proposed as a performance solution to that described in Part 3.2, the proposal must comply with these, and we don't get the particulars of those. So it's all sort of chopped up. Maybe I should have got the PDF version instead, because we can sort of see it in context. But basically that will set out, it has to do this, it has to do that, it has to do that. So you can if you're an engineer, you can design your own way of going about doing a footing system or a slab, but it has to meet certain performance requirements. We've got 3.2.1. So, so that performance solution said it has to meet these particular things. But I'll So as I mentioned before, that volume 2 is reasonably prescriptive. It tells you how to go doing things. So if you do a step-in footings, this is how you have to do your reinforcing. This is how the reinforcing has to be laid out, etc. If we're doing compacted fill, controlled fill, etc., this is how it has to be dealt with. So it's really quite prescriptive. It tells you how to do it, but it also references Australian standards as well. So basically it says to comply, it has to be done as per AS 2870, and also for concrete is as per AS 3600. So we have that referencing, so determined in accordance with criteria specified in that section of AS 2870. So that's the structure of how everything is deemed compliant within Australia, is that we have the National Construction Code, and that references the Australian standards. I've got a couple other things such as minister's specification, and we'll be touching on minister's specifications, or might touch on some of them next week, because next week we're going to be covering a little bit about building bushfire prone areas. There are minister's specifications around building bushfire prone areas. So we have various different ministers for certain things, and they say, well, when you build houses in South Australia, you have to do this particular thing. So they're state-based directives that sit separately from the National Construction Code and the Australian standards. Have I confused everybody enough? With all that? Yes. Look, yeah, I've given you the broad overview. Now, we're going to be covering this sort of stuff for the next 16 weeks, plus you're also going to be doing it in detail in compliance. So if you're confused at this stage, that's fine. So, we've seen how to access Australian standards and access National Construction Code. Bit of information here about private certification. I might just open that up. So this is for you to read yourself at home, but I think I basically gave you the crux of what you engage a private certifier for. That's for when you've got planning approval, so the council says yes, you can build this thing here, and then you want to get full approval, which is building rules consent. You can send that to the private certifier, and they can say yes, your design complies with all the relevant codes and standards and directives. So that's what the private certifier is for. And also, in a few weeks' time, hopefully we're getting back again, we're having what's called an attendance day. You guys attend every, several times a week, most of you. But for all of the external students, we've got to bring them in for various different bits and pieces. We try to bring them in all on the one day. It's a very hectic day. But a great thing about that day is that we also get in speakers from various different industries on that day as well. You guys, being internals, can still come along to that. You can still come along to all the talks. And what we've had happen the last few times is get a fellow called Daryl Johns in from Catnich Dodd, private certifiers, to talk about the nitty-gritty of building bushfire prone areas, because it's not so much a mess or a minefield, but it's difficult to get your head around all the nuances of it. So we'll cover that a bit next week, but also he comes in to help discuss about it. The reason he wants to give up his time for doing that sort of thing is because basically he wants to make his job easier. If he can help you guys understand all of this stuff, then when you're sending your plans through to him, it's about him going through, yes, it's got all that, great. There you go. Certification, $500, thank you very much. Whereas if he's going, oh, I've got to get you on the phone about this, or about that, you know, that money's much harder earned. So anyhow, it is a good thing to have a good working relationship with your private certifier, and find a good private certifier to use. But they also want you to understand as much of this as possible to make their jobs easier as well. So anyhow, come along to that. If we get Daryl back in again, come along to it. It's a wealth of information. Anyhow, following on from that, there's the website, the Your Home website, which is produced by the state government. Has anybody seen that? Yeah. Oh, you clicked on it just now?
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah, it's a great website for a whole bunch of stuff. Please don't just produce all your reports by reference to the Your Home website. It's a great resource, but it's not everything. It's probably not even 5% of what's out there. But excellent resource to start off with. And look, and so passive design. That's about using the passage of the sun basically to increase the livability of your house. Get lots of warmth into your house during winter time, and provide lots of shade to your house during summertime. So it's just about being smart basically. That's something that's not going away. We're going to have to think about ways of building houses that are energy efficient and that are lovely places to live in, and that's why we're in the industry, right? So get your head around it. It's not something which is specifically on the shopping list of what we have to cover in this subject and what I have to ensure that you've done. It sort of refers to what the unit does, but it is something which is not going away, and is something that I think is important for you to understand, is designing energy efficient houses, or at least houses that utilise the sun well for winter warmth and summer cooling. Underneath that, we've got what was that? Yeah. So that's a written description of all your various classifications of buildings. So I referred to classifications earlier on when I was talking about the NCC is split into two bits. So Class 1 is your residential dwellings. Class 1A is a single dwelling, being a detached house, etc., etc. Class 1B is a boarding house. That and Class 10 are in Volume 2, NCC. The rest, 2 through to 9, are in Volume 1 of the NCC. Class 2 is a building containing 2 or more sole occupancy units. Sole occupancy units, that basically means that unit, and it's not necessarily a residential unit, right? But it's a building which is contained and meant to be accessed separately than other buildings which are contained and accessed separately. Another important aspect of these descriptions is that it contains fire. So it's not just about somebody, living in that and having their own space, but if their apartment catches fire, those apartments have to be designed to contain the fire within that space, so it's not spreading to other apartments for a given amount of time. So sole occupancy unit, Class 3, a residential building other than Class 1 or 2, so such as a hotel, motel, etc. A Class 4 is a dwelling on top of, well, not always on top of, but as part of a 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9. So with a lot of office buildings around the city, you've got your old caretakers' residences on top. Has anybody ever seen one of those? Yeah, maybe, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, yeah, friends of mine lived in one on top of the IOOF building on Grenfell Street, a big tall building, it's got a house on the top. Like it actually looks like a bungalow, like on top of a commercial building. Yeah, I guess you don't get to see them too much because from the street you can't see up on top of the roofs of these buildings. But once you live in one of these places, you see all the other ones around, full of uni students doing share housing. Yeah. There are a few of those. So they're class 4 buildings. Class 5 is an office building. Class 6 is a shop or something like that. This would be a cafe or so. Class 7 building, which is a car park or storage. 8, a laboratory. Or for process production, assembling, altering, repairing, packaging, fishing, cleaning, blah, blah, blah. So on farms, you've got quite a few class 8 buildings, which are shearing sheds, things like that. Class 9, a building of public nature, so that's what we're in at the moment. We're in a class 9 building, and then class 10, a non-habitable building or structure. So all of these associated structures. So that is there on the Learn page for your quick reference. It's also written within the NCC. So early on, the NCC shows that. Right, a couple other things. NCC overview. Oh, that's not published to students. Maybe that's an older one. Plenty of these resources on the ABCB site as well. Okay. Where are we? Where's our consultants and authorities? Excuse me. Here we go. Got written as an introduction topic. So I've got another 45 minutes. I'll go through this, try to get through this as quickly as we can. Yeah. Another thing about the lectures, 2.5 hours. We've got a lot to cover. We're covering from residential through to commercial buildings and understanding as much of that as we can in 16 weeks. So it will be a sprint to the finish from this point. So we've covered our different classes of buildings, and that's here in the slides as well, and diagrammatically represented there. So class 1, houses, townhouses. Class 2, our flats and units. Class 3, boarding houses. Class 5, offices. Class 4 is the flat within an office block. Class 6 are shops, cafes, etc. Class 7, warehouses. Class 8, factories. Class 9, schools, healthcare, assembly, etc. Class 10, garages. So so here we go. I said you'll hear the BCA pop up every now and again. So National Construction Code, or people still refer to it as the BCA. Well, it's a really grainy certificate of title. Has anybody here ever seen a certificate of title? Yeah. Yeah. So that's what legally defines a portion of land, or a portion of land, or even it legally defines an interest in a property. So if I buy, let's say I buy a unit within a tower block and it's part way up, I'm not actually purchasing a portion of land. What I'm purchasing is a geographic space within a strata. So I'm actually purchasing something that a pocket of space above the ground. That if that tower block gets busted away by an earthquake, I still own that pocket of space. I can't really, it doesn't really help me out very much. But you can have a certificate of title for such a thing. So that defines an interest. So I have an interest in that pocket of space, right? I want to live there, etc. Or that interest can be that I have some form of ownership and control over a geographic area of soil, of land, based on the ground. So that's what this sets out. So it sets out. It gives. Oh, geez, sorry, it's so grainy there. Gives. What this says description of land. Yeah, I might provide you with another certificate title on the learn page. But description of land, and that description doesn't say, oh, it's got lovely deep soils that grows green grass and has trees and a few fences, etc. What it does, it says it is allotment this, within deposited plan this, within section that, and 100 that. So our entire state is divided up under something called a Torrens title system, developed here in South Australia, Torrens. But actually that system is being exported around the world now as well. I think Russia adopted the Torrens title system when the Soviet Union was broken down. Because it is a fairly efficient titling system. So we've got something to be proud of there. So this Torrens title system that we use here in South Australia, that has everything broken into what are called hundreds. So I don't know what 100 we're sitting in here. Maybe it's 100 of Marion or something, but you'll see that on certificates of title. You'll see 100 of something or other. And that covers a large area. And then those hundreds are broken down once again into sections. So with early settlers, when they purchased land or were given land, they were given a section. So you have the 100, and then and that's carved up into these bits called sections. Then those sections have been further divided into plans called deposited plan or filed plan, predominantly. There are also other types of plans, I won't confuse you with all of those. Well, another common one is now is community plan as well. So filed, deposited, and community plans. And then those plans cover a certain geographic area. It's not typically a rectilineal sort of square or anything like that. It's just a patchwork of plans, survey plans, because they all happen at different times independently. And then those plans are divided up into allotments. And typically, if you're going to go out and purchase some land on which to build, you'll purchase an allotment. So you'll purchase, so your legal description will be Lot 1 in Deposited Plan 3980 within Section 303 of the 100 of Onkaparinga. For example, that's what this says. So it says that particular little piece of land within this broader description. There are many odd permutations and so on to that ownership structure. You'll get to know those over time, but it's sort of way too much for us to cover, and it's not really part of that shopping list. But within that, let's say I purchased this small piece of land. Sometimes there's something like an electricity line going across the top, going above me. And the people who own those electricity lines don't want me building a house under that, predominantly. So the way they stop people building houses under electricity lines is they have an easement. That is a third party that has an interest in your land. And that's actually drawn onto your allotment diagram to say, under this portion, SA Power Networks maintain an easement. And then you can go into your Form 1, which is a description of the property when you purchase the property that has to be supplied by either conveyancer or estate agent. And it says the nature of this easement is blah, blah, blah. Now you can also go to the Land Titles Office to see exactly the nature of an easement. Or if you see on your title, there's easement to SA Power Networks XXX number, you can also contact SA Power Networks and say, what is the nature of this easement? So easements control what you can do about building on something. I've heard many people say that, oh, you've got an easement, you can't build there, game over. It's not always the case. I suggest always explore the nature of an easement, and also always contact the holder of the easement to get clarification of what you can do. So I've seen several circumstances in which there have been SA Power Networks easements over properties, and I've contacted them, and they've said, oh, well, that is, well, in one case in particular, they said, oh, that easement is there simply because that used to be a road, and we're running a power line down that road, but because that power line's right on the other side of that easement, the first 4 metres of that easement, we don't have an issue with you encroaching on that. Or in another case, there's an easement, but the power lines are up really high, and they said, look, it's fine for you to build directly across that easement if you want, as long as the ridge line of the roof is 6 metres away from the underside of those power lines. So do explore the nature of easements. So you'll see them written on your title there. It's not always game over. Then after that, there's schedule of endorsements. Schedule of endorsements, that lists who else has an interest in the property. So we've got you, who's got an interest in the property, you've got maybe an easement holder, but then you probably have to borrow money from the bank to buy land. Unless you're in exceptional circumstances, that's what the vast majority of people have to do, is borrow money from the bank, get a mortgage. You get a mortgage, that mortgage gets recorded on the title. And it says, you know, mortgagee XXX to this mortgage. Gets recorded on there. And then after that, you've got other documents affecting that title. Things such as caveats. Well, there are all sorts of documents which might affect a title. Caveat is probably the most common. Caveats are where, let's say I own this piece of land, and I get a builder in to do some building work. And I say, oh, well, thanks for building my house, but I'm not going to pay you now. I've got a house, I don't really want to have anything more to do with you. The builder can go straight, well, not to court, but there's legal mechanisms that they can go and put a caveat on the property. So that caveat means that piece of land cannot be sold on to anybody until that caveat is released. And the conditions of that caveat will be that you pay the builder X amount of money. And so, yeah. So people can do some dodgy things, but then there's also avenues for lodging caveats on land as well. But if people choose not to pay people for certain things, they can lodge a caveat on there. Or you might have caveats because there's a family dispute over ownership or something. Like somebody says, oh no, my great-grandfather in his last knowing testimony before he died, but he didn't write it down, said this, and then the court says, nah, that doesn't hold. We're placing a caveat on that. You cannot sell that until this is dissolved, etc. There's all sorts of different reasons for caveats and things like that. That's recorded on the title there as well. It's good for you to understand these things to the extent that you can, because if somebody engages you to go doing things, first of all, you want to be sure that they own that piece of land to begin with. That there aren't any other caveats to other builders that haven't been paid. I mean, that's a fair indication that you might not get paid as well. But also to know the legal boundaries, where you can actually be building, can you be building on this easement, etc. So all good stuff to know and to learn. Another thing that constrains what you can and cannot do on a piece of land, so there's boundaries, easements, etc. Oh, there's another thing that you'll hear referred to quite often, encumbrances. Has anybody ever heard of the word encumbrance? No. So to encumber is to control. Like, so, yeah, I'm walking along, somebody grabs my arm and holds me up. Essentially, they're encumbering me. I don't, we don't sort of walk around and go, hey, stop encumbering me. We'll say plenty of other things, but that's where that word comes from, the Old English, to encumber. So an encumbrance stops you from doing something. So an easement is an encumbrance because it stops you from doing something. But there are lots of other encumbrances as well, things that control what you can do on and are lodged on a title. Another one is developers' encumbrances. So let's say I purchase a block of land in Mawson Lakes, for example. I think it's Delphin that did the carve up of Mawson Lakes. So they're the developer. On all of the titles there'll be something written to say that within the first 12 months preceding construction, you have to establish landscaping to the front of the dwelling. It will say that your roof can be colorbond or tile of certain colours. Say your fence can be colorbond or something of a certain height, etc. There will be all these prescriptions about what you can and cannot do on that particular block of land, typically aesthetic approaches. The reason we have developers' encumbrances is because it helps paint a picture for what is going to be built in that area. So people go, all right, I read the developers' encumbrances. That means people are going to have tile or colorbond roofs and they're going to have gardens out front, etc. It's not going to be, mud brick houses and thatched roofs and all that sort of stuff, right? So they've got a bit of an idea about that. It sort of controls the aesthetic of an area. Some people appreciate that. But as designers, shrinks what you can actually do. So those are lodged on the title as well. But beyond that, we have what's called the Development Act. That Development Act also constrains what we can and cannot do on a given piece of land. So that empowers the council to impose zoning. So the council imposed zoning through saying, we want this area to be residential, we want this area to be commercial, we want that area to be industrial. Now, Mawson Lakes, for example, that has what's called a multi-function polis. So they have commercial and residential and industrial sort of all mixed in together. It's sort of a new approach to urban planning. Jay probably knows a little bit about, sort of a bit more about that sort of thing. But that's the way councils organise actually what's happening within the built environment, within the community, is to impose zoning. And there are even things such as historic constraints. So, for example, we've got Kernelite Gardens not that far from here, just over on just near Goodwood Road there, which is characterised by 1910 to 1915 bungalows. So it's a real aesthetic. You want to go building something in Kernelite Gardens, it's heavily restricted. I mean, you have to build in this shape, with these materials, to this form, to this setback, etc. Roof height, pitch, whatnot. That picture is very clearly painted out for you within that zoning. So, Development Act enables councils to impose zoning. Now, I said we're undergoing massive changes at the moment. So there's a Development Act of 1996. There's now the Development Act of 2016, which is starting to be implemented now. The difference of that is that previously it's been councils that have their own development plans. So Unley Council will have a development plan. Mitcham Council will have a development plan. They'll be similar in many respects, but differ in some key aspects. Because Unley want to create one type of atmosphere, Mitcham will want to create another type of atmosphere, which is different to Onkaparinga Council, for example. What the New Development Act does is say there's a new development code that covers the whole of the metropolitan area. We've got 3 different development codes coming in. So this development code covering the metropolitan area says that, it goes beyond council boundaries. So it's for the whole of the metropolitan area. And that if I understand the development code for this property, well, that's exactly the same that applies in another council area. With the council plans, in a nutshell, they say, if you're in this little pocket, then it's all this stuff. With the new development code, it's a bit more like Subway. You go, all right, well, I'm residential, but then I have this on top, and I have that one on top, and that one, and that one, and that one. Except, unlike Subway, you don't get to choose, right? So in the development code, it says you are this, you are this, you are this, you are this, right? But you get the blank, residential, and then things chucked onto it, or blank watershed protection, and these bits and pieces like steep land, building bushfire prone areas, etc., lumped on top of it. So that's the difference between the new and the old. But the new hasn't been implemented yet, and nobody really knows exactly how that's all gonna roll. So good bit of a teething process there. So cover the NCC and Australian standards. Why? Basically, the main reason that we are here is because when people do building work, it requires approval. And to get that approval, you have to explain things. You have to explain things to the council, to the private certifier, and to the builder, and the various different trades. So that's what your job is. It's communicating. It's communicating what the building is, how it's going to be built. So that's what you're in the industry of, is communication. Now you communicate primarily through the drawn diagrammatically, but then you're also communicating through written specifications. But that's what you're doing. You're producing communication for approval. Because if nobody required approval, then communication could be far simpler. It would just be you communicate with the builder, and that might even be hand gestures and words. Plans definitely make things happen in a far more organised fashion. I'm not diminishing the role of a drafter to just approvals, but that is the main reason you're here, is for that process of working through approvals. So things that require approval is a new construction, a demolition or removal of a building. We need to have approval for demolition because of safety, but then also environmental controls. So if we start knocking down buildings as we wish, we might endanger people, or we might pollute the environment. So that has to be controlled. Also, another reason why demolition of buildings is controlled is this is probably going way beyond the age of this room, but there was a place called the House of Chow on Hutt Street in the city. So there is now another place called the House of Chow on Hutt Street on the eastern side. There used to be a historic building on the western side. It's now got some red brick apartments there. I can't remember, it's a cafe down the bottom. I can't remember what that cafe is called. But that building site there was the old House of Chow, which was a state heritage listed building. The developer, the person who purchased that property, wanted to knock it down, even though it was state heritage listed, and they brought in the bulldozers anyhow without approval, and removed an iconic building. As a ramification of that, then they didn't get approval to do anything, and that site sat there for about 10 years, which very important thing in construction these days is it's about turning things around quickly. Your holding costs as a developer are huge. A guy from Badge Construction was talking about this recently. Can't remember what the figures he was talking about, but it's in the tens of thousands of dollars per week, holding costs on large commercial sites like that. So it costs the developer absolute squillions to be holding a vacant site in the city for 10 years. But yeah, we also have approvals for demolition because of that as well. We don't want to just trash our built heritage. But there is many of us recognise that there's some importance to that. Also, you need approval for excavation or filling incidental to construction or demolition. So if you're digging holes and filling in holes, council want to know about it. You're making structural alterations, council want to know about it because it has to be safe. Now, council want to know about, they'll know about that via the private certifier. If you're making structural alterations, you probably won't, if it's inside the building, if nobody's going to see it and there's no aesthetic considerations, you'll probably go straight through your private certifier to the council and then go on, or via your engineer and then private certifier. Some certification companies have engineers on staff as well. They're good ones to get aligned with, because that way it's sort of one-stop shop. But yeah, you have to get approval for those. And then the Development Act says any other prescribed activity, just to bring in absolutely everything. They say any other prescribed activity, just in case, I don't know, you want to build a bikie fortress or something, and it's not specifically said within the council's information that says no bikie fortresses here. Yeah, they chuck that in there just to gather up any other things. So procedure for development approval, lodge application, and that consists of planning consent, building rules consent. Planning consent is currently with the council, but in the not too distant future it might start going to private planners, and building rules consent is predominantly now with private certifiers. Councils can handle it, but predominantly private certifiers. Planning consent is assessed against the development plan, so each council with their development plans. Building consent is assessed against National Construction Code and Australian standards. So you've got to describe things. That's what you're in the business of, and you do that through plans and specifications. Well, actually, no. I'll be a stickler for semantics. It's not plans. Plans is only ever when we're looking down on something. We also draw elevations. We also draw the side of a building. That's not a plan. That's a drawing. So we'll also plans, yeah, drawings, right? And specifications. Specification is the written description of what you're doing. Now, if I'm providing information to council and builder about building this particular room, on my plans and elevations, I'll draw in columns and things like that, and I'll have a lever saying concrete column, like off-form concrete column formed on site, like that. I'll have small descriptions of things, and then I'll also have some general notes, possibly that relate to concrete construction, also on that page, or at the end of my drawings. But what I won't do is I won't fill up the whole thing of drawings through text. I won't describe, acrylic carpet of this particular manufacturer, eggshell white acrylic paint to walls. I don't describe all of that. That goes in the specification. So in your specification, you say, Dulux, blah, 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 right, to walls, apply 3 coats. So we split things up between what goes in drawings and what goes in the specification. There's a general rule about that, is that all of your major construction aspects go onto your plans and elevations, and all of your minor construction elements go into your specification, but it's always malleable. You, as the drafters, decide where things go. Because it's all about you. Once again, you're in the business of communicating. However you can communicate the clearest about that and most effectively, do it. So, communicate through plan specifications, engineers' reports. So engineers will have to write reports about how things are done. You have to, the builder has to have indemnity insurance. You have to pay the CRTB levy, or the builder, or whoever's doing the application will have to pay the CRTB levy, which is the Construction Industry Training Board levy. So that helps fund training institutions like this. You have to do application forms and pay fees to council, certifier, etc. Your documentation's got to be made up of things such as site plans. So site plans are going to be to a scale of 1:500 or 1:200. when you guys make it through to planning and building approval, I'm a bit of a stickler on scales. The reason I'm a bit of a stickler on scales is because I know the council and private certifiers are sticklers to scales, right? We don't do site plans 1:250 or 1:300. It's a little bit archaic in that way, and the reason for that is because your scale rulers were typically in 1:100, 1:50, 1:20, 1:200, etc. Right? And people do scale plans, even though on all your plans you should have not to be scaled or refer to dimensions over scaling, etc. So you've got to have those sorts of notes. But there are standard scales to use. You don't just go, all right, yeah, stretch it to fit on the page. That's nice. Because yes, although we work from that history of manually looking at drawings with a scale ruler, people who have been working with this for a long time, you sort of get attuned to it as well. You look at something and go, oh, 1:100, that's an 820 door. You just know it. You see it, you know it. And yeah, once we start mucking with that, it puts people off. So you have certain scales. So site plan 1:500 or 1:200. We show things like allotment boundaries, easements, adjoining features, location of works and other features. So where you're actually building the house, what driveway you're doing, etc. And then various other pertinent information, like water table level, not always important. Some places it is important. Bench levels, typically you'll show, you'll mark on there where the bench level should be. So bench level, that's a mark that you keep referring back to. So you pick a point on the site where the excavators are going to be able to refer back to that with their laser, where the concreters are going to be able to refer back to it, where the roofers or the framers are going to be able to refer back to that particular level. So you record a place on the site, and then you write down what your finished floor level is in comparison to that. Council want to know about these things because typically another typical thing within development plans is it says ridge heights no greater than 6.5 metres above natural ground level. So they'll see the contours on your plan, they'll say that's what natural ground level is. Now your bench height, an extra 200 mil above that, and then your two-storey dwelling, you're getting close to that 6.5 metres. So council need to see these things. So we put on finished floor level as well. And look, I'm sort of racing through this bit, probably confusing you a lot. That's where we start, and then we pull it together over the next year or so. Following that site plan, you produce a floor plan. So your plan sets typically happen in an order as well, going from big. So you might start with locality plan, site plan, floor plan, and then you do elevations, kitchen plan, bathroom layout, etc. So you go from big to small, typically. So next one is your floor plan. That shows the entirety of the building, typically at a 1:100 scale. Now, if you're doing a really big building and a 1:100 doesn't fit on an A3 page, you've probably progressed by that stage to an A2 page anyhow. So predominantly, we draw drawings to size up onto an A3 page because that's what people have as readily accessible printers. But sometimes things have to be on A2 or A1, for larger projects. You can't just fit all that stuff onto an A4 or an A3. It just gets way too small. So floor plan has to be dimensioned. So dimensions are lines that show the distance from one point to another point. Dimensioning is probably one of the trickier things to get your head around as drafters. What it was for me is to think about how can I communicate everything? How can a builder build this thing, but I still keep my plans really clear? Like I could put dimensions onto absolutely everything, but the whole thing would be clogged with dimensions. So it's about having a systematic approach to showing the location of things, the distance between things. So, and then you've got, you know, elevations that shows the side of a building. Now, elevations are never drawn in perspective. If you're doing a schematic diagram of something, yes, you want to draw it to perspective for people to see it and go, oh, that's what it's going to look like. Elevations are not drawn in perspective. They are just flat, as if there was no vanishing point in the distance. Right? They're just drawn flat. Sections and construction details. So sections is where you draw something as if you just slice through the building. So we get this building here, slice straight through it, and then we look at that sliced out bit. The reason we draw a section is because that shows us what's happening inside those walls for various different pieces. Or we also want to show specific engineering details, and to show those specific engineering details, we want to show where that is in the building. So we put in a section, draw that section, then refer to a small piece to do a detail. That puts it all in context. Roof and wall frame layouts. So you'll typically draw where all these bits and pieces are going. You show where they go. Other things you do, kitchen plans, etc., and elevations. The specification is a written document that goes with your plans. Now I've started building our own place. For that, I didn't need a specification. I don't need to tell myself what colour I'm painting the walls, etc. like that. In fact, I don't even know yet. So you won't always need a specification for its practical application, but the thing is, you've got standard specifications put out by master builders or HIA. They contain a whole bunch of other stuff that just ticks boxes for the private certifier. So even if you don't need a specification for something, you still have to grab one of those from either one and include them in your documentation set, and you just don't fill it out, apart from particulars. And then, you also have to convey other information such as wind speed. So some areas are windier than others. So some areas are quite protected. So here in the metropolitan area, it's not so windy unless you build on the esplanade. If you're right on that face of the ocean, it's windier. If you're right up on top of a hill, it's windier. So we have different wind speeds for different areas around the state. I think we've spoken enough about private certifiers. Throughout the process of building, you also have to provide notification. You have to provide notification to council, and then also notification to engineer at certain stages. These are called hold points in construction. You cannot progress further until you've made that notification. So, such as, excavation trench stage, you have to notify the engineer that you're at that stage, because if you go putting steel and then concrete in those trenches, how can an engineer inspect and make sure you've done those trenches correctly if it's all full of stuff? The only way to do that is to jackhammer it up. You don't want that happening. That's why we have hold points in construction. And so you notify both council and engineer. Typically what you'll do is you'll tell the council, we're doing this on this date, and this on this date, and this and this and this. So you let them know, and then if they want particulars, or if they want 48 hours before everything happens, they'll tell you. If they don't, they'll go, you've done your job. But your engineer, you'll be on the phone with them a lot more. So you say, yeah, we're doing this. Can I fit in an evening appointment for inspection of steelwork, etc. So then it's wall frame and then roof frame. So you have to tell council and engineers when they're going on as well, because these are things which are important structural elements which are typically concealed. Once the cladding's on there, then nobody can really see what it is. Sorry, I'll power through for the next 6 minutes, so we're all covered, and then going to let you go. Builders licensing, you can't just go out there and say, I'm a builder and I'll build. Well, actually, you kind of can, but you shouldn't. So you want to be able to get insurance as a builder. Also, your builder's licensing is broken up into two things. There's the builder's license and there's the site supervisor's license. whenever you put an application into council or the private certifier to say we're doing this, it'll have to have on that application who the nominated site supervisor is for those works. Because it's broken into those two bits, builder and site supervisor, but you must have a site supervisor, a lot of people who hold a builder's license hold site supervisor's license as well. The site supervisor's license is actually the important bit. Various different ways of getting it. One of the ways is to sit in an interview with the Consumer Business Services in Grenfell Street, or you can study construction and then work as an apprentice under a builder and then go through Consumer Business Services documenting your various different bits. Basically everybody who holds a builder's license holds a restricted builder's license. It's restricted to something. So some will say, oh, restricted to carpentry and roof framing, if they've got a roof framing ticket. Or, you know, there are larger restrictions such as like restricted to 1 story or restricted to 2 story, etc. So that's typically what people will hold, is licenses are restricted to certain activities or certain sizes of buildings. I think if you want to take this sort of work further, having a builder's license can actually be very handy, because if you're the designer and drafter, you've got that relationship with the private certifier. If you're also the builder, then you take it from start to finish, basically. And if you're an architect, if you've got your you have to have your masters in architecture, and then you also have to sit architecture. You have to do 2 years of like architectural apprenticeship before sitting for your registration. Do you know what it's called? What's that? AACA. So if you do that, well then basically you're fulfilling those requirements of the site supervisor, and you can operate as a site supervisor. And so you can take it from start to finish. So architects can do that, but building designers and drafters can also do the same thing if you get your builder's license on top. So it's, you know, you never get to use the name architect. Architect is just for people who have completed that study and get their registration. But you can be an architect in function, essentially, but not named by patchworking these things together. But to do that, oh gee, I still haven't need to change this slide so you're able to carry on a small business, not a mall business. I'm not doing a shopping around the mall. It's a small business. Excuse me for that. So yeah, it allows you to contract for building work if you have that. But you need to show that you've got knowledge of business operations. So you can do business studies. Yeah, pretty much the only way of doing that is to do some sort of study. And must be financially viable. So you need to have a minimum $10,000 in the bank, or a letter from an insurance company like, no, I won't name an insurance company, but yeah, there's a very limited pool of insurers who will do public liability for builders, or builders indemnity insurance. So those insurers, if you get a letter from them saying, yes, we'll cover that person up to this particular amount, then that's another way of meeting that criteria: financially viable, good character, not an undischarged bankrupt. Well, if you're bankrupt and that's not undischarged, well, you probably won't be able to meet a couple of these other ones. Covered that. Yeah. So all building projects have to have builder's indemnity insurance. So that covers the person who purchases the building in the end. So for the next 5 years, if something goes wrong and that builder no longer operates a business, they have that recourse through the insurance for rectification of building. And all licensed builders are required to take out indemnity insurance on contracts over $12,000. A lot of councils now are asking for indemnity insurance on much lower sums. So councils have that discretion, but the absolute cut-off is $12,000. So if anything costs more than $12,000, it has to have builder's indemnity insurance. And when you engage a builder, or if you're going to be a builder yourself, and clients are engaging you, that's going to be via a contract. So there has to be a written contract to carry out their work. In fact, you want to have a written contract. Either side of the fence, whichever side of the fence you're on, you want to have that contract. There are standard form contracts, either through Housing Industry Association or Master Builders, or there's an Australian standard for the constraints of how contracts are drawn up in commercial work. Because for residential, it's fairly straightforward. You know, you can have a pro forma contract that covers everything. For commercial, it gets a bit more interesting. You may not want to use a standard form contract. So that's the introduction to the background of what we're going to be working in. Yeah, we're right on 11:30 now. Are there any questions or so? Sorry to open it up right in the last minute. People, yeah. So I've probably confused you enough. We'll be covering a lot of these little bits and pieces again and referring to this sort of stuff as we work our way through over the next few weeks. What you can do now is I'll probably take a breather and get a good lunch, but also have a look at the Learn page, familiarise yourself with things over the next few weeks. We'll be looking at, don't delve into the assessment tasks too much yet, not until I explain them. So I'll be explaining them next week, as well as starting you on that first task. So we'll sort of get into that next week. But in the meantime, just have a bit of a poke around the Learn page, have a bit of a look. And thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks, Mike.
Cheers.